Good afternoon and welcome to the Middle East Institute's fifth lecture series on 101 Introduction to the Middle East. I'll be covering the United Nations and the Arab-Israeli conflict in today's discussion. Given that it's 100 years old, almost 100 years old, I'll be covering a lot of ground, but I'll inevitably miss a few areas which you can raise in the Q&As at the end. I plan to speak for about 60 minutes, hopefully. And one of the central questions that that you may want to think about in my talk today is whether why has the United Nations paid so much attention to the Arab-Israeli conflict? If you think about the number of UN resolutions that have been adopted, its role in development projects, its role on the ground, discussions of human rights at the Human Rights Council. One question we might be raised is why is this the case? Is there something more to it, or does the UN have a special responsibility? And I'll be arguing that the UN does have a special responsibility, but to understand this, we have to appreciate the historical aspects of the dispute. So what we'll be covering today is, we'll go back to the period just before the establishment of the League of Nations, looking at the Balfour Declaration, the centenary of which is in less than 2 weeks' time. Then we'll then look at the role of the League of Nations and the British mandate of Palestine. So the first, if you like, half of the 20th century. We'll then look at the period at the end of the mandates when the United Nations first becomes involved with the UN partition plan. Then we'll look at the period called decolonization and the Third World Revolution and the way in which, if you like, the Palestinian cause became viewed as an anti-colonial struggle in the global South Third World. And then, if you like, a reaction to that, the start of the peace process with the Arab states, and to a certain extent the sidelining of the role of the United Nations, if you consider its role at the start of the establishment of the organization and the way in which its influence has waned, the establishment of separate bodies and the UN Quartet and great powers becoming involved, Arab states taking matters into their own hands, separate peace agreements being signed with Egypt, between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan. And so we might end up asking whether the United Nations has been an effective body. So the first, one of the first things that's important to be aware of is that the Arab-Israeli conflict is older than the United Nations. It's not that old, though. It doesn't go back 2,000 years, at least not in my opinion. It's about approximately 100 years old, and as a result of conflicting claims made during the First World War about the disposition of the Levant region in particular by the great powers at the time, as well as the emerging principle of self-determination with different groups making claims to territory. It also has the 19th century Jewish question also has a role in the issue of anti-Semitism, and throughout the mandate, Jews were encouraged to settle in Palestine, and this led to a conflict with the inhabitants who were already living there. But I'll discuss that a little bit more in length. And of course, the inequality was a hallmark of international relations in this period. So the League of Nations was quite different to the United Nations. Its membership was much smaller. Some states were given more powers than others. Most of the world was in other words, equality wasn't a formal right as it is in the UN Charter. And most of the world was still under colonial rule, and that was considered perfectly lawful at the time. This would change quite dramatically during the period of the United Nations. So the main two, if you like, political ideologies that have been clashing for the most part has been Zionism and Arab nationalism. And it's interesting that Zionism has always the role of law and legitimacy played a central role from the beginning of the Zionist Congress in 1897, where the aim of Zionism was to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine secured by public law. But in order to achieve this goal, the Zionist movement needed a great power, because Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time. So in order to secure their consent, there were negotiations between representatives of the Zionist organization and the Grand Vizier in Istanbul, but this didn't lead to anywhere. Subsequently, during the First World War, the British Empire took up the cause of Zionism. Around the same time, we had Arab nationalism emerging, primarily anti-Turkish movements, and later an anti-Zionist movement, and the Arabs sought independence with a state of their own in Palestine. And the link with colonialism from the Zionist organization also gives us a perspective as to why there was hostility towards the Zionist project during the heights of decolonization, when the Third World kind of took the Palestinian cause became aligned with anti-colonial struggles in Africa and Asia. Now, Palestine becomes of importance, or I should say the Levant region becomes of some importance during the late 19th century, with the role of missionaries, but in particular was the opening of the Suez Canal in 1867, which cut the trade route between Europe and the colonies, particularly in Asia. British Empire's biggest colony was, of course, British India, which then included Pakistan and Burma and Sri Lanka. And of course the Dutch East Indies, etc. This part of the world. Palestine is also important because of the holy places. We can see on this map, we can see the extent of the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the First World War, and the caravan route from Istanbul down to Mecca and Medina, and Jerusalem was on that route. And really, it's the holy places that, if you like, make Israel, Palestine, the Holy Land, different to any other territory. It's the reason why, if you like, outside actors are interested in it. So this is showing Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia and Jerusalem. Jerusalem used to be the first direction of prayer, or Qibla, before that honor was bestowed on Mecca. And it's seen as important to this day, and for that reason it's seen as a symbol in a city that, from the Arab perspective, is under occupation and annexation. And so it's an important factor to understand why there's so much interest in this particular dispute. Of course, Jerusalem is also important to Christians and Jews, and we can also see this in some of the colonial documents, why Palestine was signaled out, if you like, for special treatment. So this is a map showing the famous Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was a secret agreement concluded in London between the British and French foreign secretaries, and it essentially carved out the Levant into spheres of influence, primarily between the French and the British, but the Russian Empire and the Italian Empire also had interests. So the green bit this was in the middle of the First World War, when the Allies were pretty confident of victory, and the idea was to avoid a conflict between the great powers. At the end of the war, they would share out the spoils between them. And it's not so different to the way in which, if you like, Iraq, Jordan, and Syria, if you were to look at a modern map, it's not so different. It had a lot to do with the discovery of oil in Mosul, and in the interwar years there were pipelines to Haifa and to Tripoli in Lebanon that was operational for a period. But the point I want to make here is, if you look at the Holy Land, or Palestine as it was then called, it's in brown, and it was envisaged that it would be an international territory, and again the reason is because of the holy places. The issue is more complicated because there was a prior agreement negotiated between the British government, a secret exchange of letters with a sheriff of Mecca called the Hussein McMahon Correspondence, and there were disputes over the extent of pledges made between the two sides. The Arab side thought that the whole of the Levant, with the exception of Lebanon, had been offered to them. Things then become more complicated because a year after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, we have the Balfour Declaration, the centenary of which will be very soon. There's a whole series of events taking place in the UK for the centenary, and you can imagine different views are being expressed. So the Balfour Declaration was a letter from the Foreign Secretary, Lord Balfour, to another member of Parliament called Lord Rothschild, promising to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. There were two provisos. The first was conditioned on nothing being done which might prejudice the civil and political rights of Jews in other countries, and the second referred to what they called the non-Jewish communities in Palestine, civil and religious rights. The declaration was at the time a war measure. There are all kinds of theories why the British government issued it, but the actual document would later find expression in the League of Nations Covenant, and this is where the real dispute begins, as I argue. And that is because the League of Nations was established a mandate system in which it sought to establish self-government for different mandates. But the Balfour Declaration seemed to be saying something else. So this immediately caused friction between the mandatory authority, the Zionist organization, and the Arab population of Palestine. Before I go into details, let me just show you, give you an idea of the League of Nations and the mandates. So the mandates were established. So if you look at this map, if you look at the orange territories, these are all the different mandates that were established. And these were territories that were, if you like, acquired from the losers of the First World War, primarily the German Empire and the Ottoman Empire. But the mandates were staggered into different classes. So if you look at the A mandates were all in the Middle East, where the Palestine was. The B mandates were primarily in Central and Southern Africa, and then the C mandates were in the Pacific. If we take a closer look at the Middle East mandates, we can see, again, they look very similar to the modern states today. There's a few name changes. In 1922, the British government divided the Palestine mandate into two halves, creating the British Mandate of Palestine and the Mandate of Transjordan. So the French took Syria and Lebanon. The British took Iraq, Transjordan, and the Palestine Mandate. Now, I mentioned to you the Balfour Declaration, but then if we look at the League of Nations, if you like, the Constitution of the League of Nations, it says something, it appears to say something else. So it refers to the colonies and territories which were acquired during the late war by peoples who were not yet able to stand by themselves, and then importantly it says that there should be applied the principle that the well-being and development of such peoples form a sacred trust of civilization, and that securities for this trust should be embodied in this covenant. And the mandates were staggered into A, B, and C class mandates. The A, B, and C class mandates is simply the paragraphs referred to in Article 22 of the Covenant, Palestine being formerly part of the Ottoman Empire, whose independence had been provisionally recognized. So with the exception of Palestine, Syria, Mesopotamia, Lebanon all became independent states. Well, Iraq was the first state to become independent, provisionally independent, through a treaty system, followed by Syria and Lebanon in the 1940s. And then Israel was established. We'll come back to that in 1948. The point simply I want to make here is it was seen as a Class A mandate. So the idea is independence was a goal that was to be achieved sooner than later. So if you look at Southwest Africa, it was right at the bottom. But when we consider events today, Southwest Africa, it's actually a very similar case because it was only became independent in 1990, and the South African government was opposed to its independence. But if you think of Palestine as opposed to Israel, a separate state, it's still not independent. And this is one of the reasons why the United Nations has taken a greater interest in events there, a point that I'll come back to. Now, we should bear in mind when the Balfour Declaration was issued, the population of the mandated territory of Palestine was over 90% Arab. Arab meaning Christians and Muslims, and the rest were Jews. Most of the Jews that lived in Palestine at the time spoke Arabic or Ladino. Very few spoke Hebrew, but that would change in the course of time. And they weren't really distinguished so much at the time. This was more of a colonial invention when statistics started to differentiate between communities based on their religious affiliation. Now, because of the Balfour Declaration and which was enshrined in the Covenant of the League of Nations, Britain, and there was a lot of opposition to it in the House of Lords, even was in the war cabinet, not to mention from the Palestinian Arabs themselves. There were a few rebellions and riots. There was a period of military occupation before the mandate was formally granted by the League of Nations, which entered into force in the early 1920s. But Britain felt obliged. It felt that it had to abide by its international obligations. This was a time when states took their obligations quite seriously. And so Britain felt that it couldn't retain the mandate and renege on the Balfour Declaration, because this was a condition to which it had been awarded the mandate. And part of that policy was to encourage, to create a national home for the Jews. You had to encourage immigration of Jews, mostly at that time from Europe. And so you can see throughout particularly during the 1930s, a very sharp increase in Jewish immigration to Palestine. Obviously, this was the result from persecution of Jews primarily in Germany just before the Second World War. And then we can see also 1939, just before the outbreak of the Second World War, immigration is substantially reduced, and this is a policy decision by the British government enshrined in the 1939 White Paper. There were various reasons why Britain changed its policy then. One was a looming war, and there'd been an Arab revolt, a rebellion. There was also increasing opposition to British policy in other parts of the empire, particularly British India. Mahmoud Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League threatening to stop Indian troops being used in the war there, and making quite a lot of noise in London at different roundtable conferences, and at one point threatening to bring a case against the British government at the Permanent Court of International Justice. And so we see a British shift in policy then. Of course, this upsets the Zionist movement. And then there's a Biltmore Conference when the Jewish Agency seeks to establish a Jewish Commonwealth. Some movements go underground, and then we see a revolt at the time. So the first revolt was the Arab revolt against the Brits in the 1930s. That's put down quite brutally. Various partition plans are suggested to, if you like, resolve this dispute. But it's not supported by the British government, who views partition at that moment from being impracticable. We then have the White Paper and a shift. The Jewish movement goes underground, and then after the Holocaust, there's a revolt. So British troops are being attacked and basically driven out from Palestine. And in fact, it's that war right at the end of the Second World War. Britain's on its knees, and there's another revolt, this time from the Jewish community. Britain decides it's time to pull out. But this raises important questions, because by this time the United Nations, it raises important legal questions as well as questions of responsibility, because by 1945 the UN had already been established. The League of Nations is dissolved a year later, and there is an implicit understanding that the United Nations would have the responsibility for the mandates, especially if they didn't become independent states. And this is where the dispute over Palestine and over South Africa, which didn't want to relinquish Southwest Africa, came to the fore. So in April 1947, Again, the British government's divided. They don't know what to do with Palestine, so they decided to ask the United Nations to come up with a solution, if you like. And this is when the UN General Assembly, there's various UN committees to begin with. There are various proposals. Again, partition is raised. Others speak of keeping the territory intact as a UN trusteeship agreement, which is like the continuation, basically, of the mandate, but with instead of Britain being the mandatory power, the United Nations would be the mandatory power. And the short of the story is that a majority, slim majority of the UN General Assembly favor a partition plan. This is the vote. There's quite a lot of opposition, though, and when you consider the opposition to the plan, most of them are the neighboring countries, so that's not very practical. We also have it's interesting to see that India and Pakistan voted against the partition plan because they'd just been divided a couple of months earlier. We also have an unusual case in that this is the early Cold War period. We have the US and the USSR, Soviet Union, voting together in favor of the resolution. This immediately is considered suspicious because the Soviet Union had been opposed to the partition plan and suddenly decided it was a good idea. And this worries the Americans all of a sudden. The Brits also are very suspicious, and they abstain. In fact, they're against partition because part of the plan was to send a commission from New York to the mandate and to look into the practicalities of actually creating, if you like, two states in this small bit of land, and the British government blocks it. It blocks the commission from traveling, so they're not able to leave New York. And I'll just explain a little bit about what the plan entailed. So it entailed establishing like a corpus separatum, an international zone in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which would continue under a special UN regime. The Arab state was highlighted in yellow. This was the extent of its territory. Jaffa was also going to be part of the Arab state. Jaffa, right next to Tel Aviv, was one of the main ports at the time. And the Jewish state, under the plan, was to be in the area established colored in blue on the map. The Arabs were opposed to this because even at this time they continued to be the majority of the population, and they argued that self-determination in essence meant majority rule. If you have a democratic vote, most people were against it, but no one asked for their consent to partition, so they said it was unfair. They also pointed out that with the exception of the Tel Aviv-Jaffa area, Arabs remained in ownership of most of the land as well, so they said this is a very unfair plan. The reason why the plan, however, was quite generous, awarded most of the land to the Jewish state, was because there was an attempt by some of the countries that favored partition to link it to the Jewish refugee issue in Europe and to encourage the survivors to go to Palestine. This was opposed by the Arab states, who said that this was a problem for the whole world and it was not fair that the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia kept their doors closed to immigration. And if it was a humanitarian issue, everyone had to help. And it couldn't just be Palestine, where there was already an armed conflict taking place. It wasn't a good place for this. The Zionist organization tentatively accepted the plan with some reservations. But what's crucial to understand is a few months after the partition plan was voted for, the US got cold feet. And they came up with a trusteeship proposal. And the reason why they got cold feet is, well, first, Britain wasn't willing to implement the plan. And secondly, they were concerned that the Soviet Union would have a role in any peacekeeping force or any force that was sent to implement partition. The US Defense Secretary thought that you'd need at least 100,000 troops on the ground to implement it, and no one was willing to provide that number of troops after the Second World War for this. And so what we have so the British government says, well, we're leaving anyway, and we're not going to help you with trusteeship. Some of the groups, the Haganah, the Irgun, and others decide to go on the offensive because if the trusteeship plan is put into effect, it means the perpetuation of the mandates. That means no Jewish state. because only through partition was it possible to internationally, if you like, to delineate partition. This is the first time an international body had sanctioned the establishment of a Jewish state. There was a Peel partition plan in the UK. That was just an internal colonial document. It wasn't sanctioned by, if you like, the global community at the time. And so there's a series of conflicts between the, immediately after partition, a kind of small-scale civil war, and then the Arab states become embroiled. I should mention that 350,000 Palestinians had fled before the end of the mandate. So the mandate was terminated at midnight on the 15th of May 1948. And by that time, already half the Arab population had already fled. So one of the interesting questions that I'm looking at the moment is, what's the question of British responsibility? Because the British government has still got troops on the ground, still responsible for law and order. We all know that the Arabs then there was a war between the Arabs and the and Jewish groups. This is before the establishment of the state, during which Israel emerged victorious. But one question very few people are asking is, well, what were the British troops doing at the time? And again, this is important for, again, not just understanding the conflict, but potentially for legal claims, because there are treaties that are in force that give that dispute resolution clauses that one could envisage making a claim. So, to cut a long story short, after the 1948 war, Israel wins. Okay, I should go back to this. Some Israeli scholars have suggested that there was a secret agreement between the Yishuv, or the Jewish agency, and the Hashemite, the Kingdom of Transjordan, as it was then called, to, if you like, divide the mandate between themselves. And there's documentary evidence to suggest this. This is also borne out by what happened afterwards. So Israel was acquired territory, more than actually was awarded it in the UN partition plan. And Jordanian troops acquired a substantial chunk of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Now, at this point, the Arab Legion, which was the official name for the Jordanian army, was commanded by British commanders, British troops. And so the role of the Brits, again, is key to understanding this. They walk into and it's King Abdullah's the king at the time, they walk into Jerusalem, and they, in a nutshell, they annex the territory. And the Arab League condemns it, says, again, this is not done with the consent of the population, although there was if you like, a delegate of notables that approved of the merger, which they called it, in the Jordanian parliament. Very few states recognize annexation. The key issue again was over Jerusalem, and the reason is under the UN partition plan, Jerusalem was not supposed to be part of any state. It was supposed to be a UN special entity, and it's for that reason that until this very day, no state has an embassy in Jerusalem. They're all in Tel Aviv. And the reason is because no one recognizes sovereignty, neither in the East nor the West. Although for practical purposes, nearly all of Israel's government ministries are in Jerusalem. With regard to with respect to the Gaza Strip, this was placed under Egyptian administration, but Egypt didn't take any steps to claim the territory. Just that they were administering it until the Palestinian state was established. So that's the state of play up until the end, the bare bones, if you like, up until the end of the mandate. We then enter the period of the Cold War and decolonization. And so for the next 15 minutes, I'll talk briefly a bit about what happened during this period, and particularly the role of the United Nations. This is just if you like, a historical timeline of what was going on. I've highlighted the Six-Day War just to give you a sense of all the changes that had been taking place and why there was so much opposition expressed in the United Nations. Not so much from the great powers at the time, but from, if you like, the global south, the third world, that was becoming increasingly important in UN bodies as their numerical number increased in the 60s and 70s. So you can see several revolutions taking place in the 1950s. You can see the struggle against apartheid taking off. The UN condemns colonialism in 1960. Treaties prescribing racial discrimination are adopted by the United Nations. A Human Rights Covenant is adopted for the first time. There's also a convention on the prohibition of intervention, military intervention in the affairs of other states. And then there's the Six-Day War, in which Israel acquires, if you like, the rest, not only the rest of the mandate, but substantial parts of Egypt and Syria. And then after that, we see again a definition of aggression, recognition of national liberation movements, and also the laws of war beginning to accommodate national liberation movements. And so this is kind of the period in which we can understand how the UN is beginning to approach the issue. So I've mentioned the Age of Revolution. We have the Chinese Revolution. We have the Algerian War of Independence. China, in fact, becomes one of the biggest, People's Republic of China, biggest sponsors of the Palestine Liberation Organization, training, arms, recognition. But the conflict that the Palestinians are most inspired by is the Algerian Revolution, when Algeria defeated the French Empire and became an independent state. We then have the Suez War, which is a tripartite invasion of Egypt by Britain, France, and Israel. The details I won't go into, but simply to say that it was not a success, and it kind of bolstered the image of Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser as a champion of the Arab cause. This is the period of Arab nationalism. And then there's the Cuban Revolution, which worries the United States, considering how close it is to the US. Intriguingly, the Cuban Revolution also has a great influence. It takes 1 year. It occurs 1 year before the United Nations adopts a colonial declaration, which was the first time the UN actually came out and said colonialism is contrary to the UN Charter. Before then, it hadn't. And the UN, you could argue, even the UN Charter, you could argue even legitimized colonialism in the form of the trust system, which was just an updated version of the mandate system. We have Che Guevara, even in the Gaza Strip, meeting Gamal Abdel Nasser, and this is in the same year, 1959, as the revolution. In the following year, when the colonial declaration is adopted, we have this competition emerging between the Soviet Union and the United States. Begins with Eisenhower, and then later with JFK, and Nikita Khrushchev, who is a Soviet premier and who tries to take advantage, if you like, of this clamoring for independence from colonial rule. The Soviet Union had very few colonies in the classic sense. I'm not talking about Eastern Europe and the Iron Curtain, but saltwater colonies, the UN used to call them, in Africa and Asia didn't have any, so it had little to lose from this, from the UN calling for an end to colonialism. And the US is a bit embarrassed because a lot of the independent countries that are emerging are from Africa and Asia. And of course we have racial segregation still in the US up until 1964. And so for those first 4 years, there's some embarrassing incidents in the US. Diplomats can't send their kids to mixed schools and eat in the same diners as the white ambassadors, etc. So there's a period of time where the US is on the defense and appears to be losing this ideological competition. So if we look at, you can see how important it was by just looking at a map of the numbers of countries becoming independent. If we look at the period between 1950 and 1960, so that is blue, lighter blue, it's really Southeast Asia and Africa. That's becoming, during which most members became independent. And this orientation really changes the entire, it doesn't change the structure, but it changes the UN organization. Its interests change, international relations, international law. The kind of priorities for developing countries were different to that of developing countries, and there's a natural kinship or affinity for other people struggling against colonial rule. And so it's in this context that we begin to see the Palestinian struggle emerge as an anti-colonial cause. Brief mention of the Six-Day War. Won't go into, oops. The United Nations passes, actually immediately after the war it passes, the UN General Assembly passes resolutions on Jerusalem actually. That's the first issue they address, and they're concerned about developments there in the old city and anything that will prejudice the city, because there are some damage done to various quarters of the old city, and a fear that Israel had taken steps to annex the city, which the UN condemned. There's a struggle again, Cold War competition, and the resolution 242 is delayed for about 6 months, but eventually a compromise is reached, and the resolution is passed. The preamble emphasizes the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. So the UN Charter actually prohibits annexation of territory. It's in Article 2.4. It's a cornerstone of the UN Charter. The resolution also called for withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. In the polemics, you usually hear the Israeli side saying this doesn't include all of the territories because of the misses the definite article before territories, although it's included in the French version. But if you notice, it refers to territories occupied in the recent conflicts, which could only have referred to territories that were acquired in June 1967. It then said all states should terminate their claims of belligerency and acknowledge their sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, etc., etc. But it doesn't mention anything about the Palestinians. So this upsets, if you like, quite a few Palestinians who began to get fed up of the, how shall we put it, the leaving things to the Arab states. And so we can see this with the formation of Fatah, which is a Palestinian National Liberation Organization founded in Kuwait, and more pertinently the PLO, Palestine Liberation, which was established in 1964 in Cairo. When it was established, its first chairman was Ahmed Shukeri. It was really under the control of Nasser. It wasn't an independent, well, I don't think it ever been an independent body, but it was really under the control of the Egyptians. However, this begins to change when the Fatah takes over. This is a picture of Yasser Arafat addressing the United Nations General Assembly in 1974 when the UN accorded the PLO recognition. He had to speak in Geneva because the Americans wouldn't give him a visa to go to New York. Now, the PLO, again, jumped on this umbrella of articulating its claims in an anti-colonial issue. It passed a charter which pointed out that the mandate was an unjust instrument, that partition was void, that it didn't recognize the establishment of the State of Israel, the armed struggle was a right of all Palestinians, etc., etc. This didn't go down well, obviously, with Israel, particularly the claim that they had a right to use violence, and there were guerrilla conflicts taking place in this period in Jordan, in Lebanon, in the border areas. And so while the UN accords the PLO recognition, gives them an office in New York, allows them to participate in debates on the Palestine question, gives them arms and immunity from the criminal jurisdiction of other countries, the Israeli government takes a obviously very different view. There's this quote from the Likud Party platform 1977, which I think sums up the view of the PLO, disputing that it's a national liberation organization, describing it as an organization of assassins, which the Arab countries are using as a political and military tool, while also serving the interests of Soviet imperialism. So that's a reminder this was the Cold War after all. Now, despite the UN being involved in passing these major resolutions trying to implement partition, the first concrete peace agreement takes place without the United Nations. And this is the Camp David Accords that were brokered by President Jimmy Carter, Anwar Sadat, and Menachem Begin in the United States. And this came on the heels of the Yom Kippur War, which was another preemptive strike by Egypt to recapture the territories lost in 1967. But importantly, it's Egypt itself. None of the Arab states are involved, not even Jordan. Jordan, remember, had a claim, had control of the West Bank up until 1967. And the Palestinians aren't included. The PLO, I should say, is not included either. there are two parts to Camp David. There's an agreement on withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula, and then there's a second part which is about the West Bank and Gaza and what was going to happen there. And the furthest the Likud were willing to go was to grant the inhabitants autonomy, which was not accepted by the PLO, who said that they wanted an independent state. We then have the United Nations getting involved. You've got third world majorities. There is an attempt by Tunisia that drafts a UN Security Council resolution calling for the establishment of a Palestinian state in 1980, but it's vetoed. And then the UN General Assembly passes lots of similar resolutions, but they don't have any impact. However, one impact is that Egypt is expelled from the Arab League. So you have the rejectionist front with the PLO, Yasser Arafat, Gaddafi, Hafez al-Assad in Syria, and others. And Egypt is actually isolated completely, doesn't rejoin the Arab League, even though it's headquartered in Cairo until till 1989. Now, around the same time that we have the peace treaties negotiated with Egypt, the Israeli government, which is the Likud, which came to power for the first time in 1977, began to embark on a settlement project. And this differed to the Labour Party's settlements, which were basically a few civilians in military and strategic military locations. The Likud desires to build settlements with the view to preventing the emergence of a Palestinian state. So large blocks of sprawling urban settlements are built around Jerusalem in particular, and other locations of the West Bank. This is pursuant to something called the Drobless Plan. And it makes the point clear that this was, again, the whole point was reducing what they call an additional Arab state, meaning another Arab state between Israel and Jordan. The argument being that an Arab state was already established in Jordan, therefore there's no need for a Palestinian state in the former mandate territory. And again, the United Nations gets involved because this plan is leaked to the press, it's published in the New York Times, someone gets hold of the original document and it's discussed. Jordan introduces the discussion in the Security Council. And in 1980 alone, we have, I think, 4 or 5 extremely toughly worded Security Council resolutions, which the Americans abstained from. In fact, one of the resolutions, Carter votes in favor of it, calling for the dismantlement of the settlements. And this doesn't have any impact. In July 1980, Israel passes another law in the Knesset, this parliament, declaring that Jerusalem is the invisible and eternal capital of Israel. And then the UN, again, passes another resolution calling on all embassies that were in Jerusalem to withdraw from the city. And at that time, there were 14 embassies, and they all moved themselves to Jerusalem. This is a picture of the US ambassador in 1980, the second African-American ambassador to be appointed by the US government to the United Nations. His name is Donald McHenry. The previous, his predecessor, is also an African-American, had to resign because he had met with PLO representatives. And so he was there passing these resolutions. If you recall, December last year, there was a big hoo-ha over another UN Security Council resolution passed by the Obama administration in the last few weeks, declaring that reiterating that Israeli settlements are contrary to international law. If you look at the language that was used last December, it's exactly the same as the language that was used in 1980. Slight changes about differentiating between settlement products. That was the only novel aspect of the resolution last year. Otherwise, it was exactly the same. And US policy has consistently been, since the early 80s, the settlements are contrary to international law, though sometimes politicians say things during election cycles that are confusing. Sadat was then assassinated. So the only Arab leader who was willing to strike a peace agreement with Israel is then gunned down by Egyptian Islamic Jihad as a traitor. But nonetheless, they press ahead with it. There's a second part of the autonomy agreement goes nowhere because the PLO did not agree with it. Then there's the invasion of Lebanon, and the PLO is driven out of Beirut. They go into exile to Tunisia. And I'm jumping through lots of things here, but feel free to ask questions at the end. Okay, we'll get to the third quarter of what I want to say today is the so-called the peace process and what I will call the sidelining of the United Nations. So the PLO is in Tunisia, and they're not pretty far away from the Levant. And in 1987, there's a spontaneous uprising in the West Bank and Gaza. The first Palestinian Intifada, not to be confused as the second Palestinian Intifada. This was largely a civil uprising, quite different to the Second Intifada, which was an armed uprising, lots of shootings and suicide bombs and helicopter gunships and the like. This wasn't like that. And it caught Israel by surprise, and Israel wasn't sure how to deal with it. Had never had so many people all of a sudden throwing stones and burning tires and going on strike. They didn't know what to do. The PLO was also caught by surprise. They were in Tunis. But they quickly pick up the phone, start calling people in the West Bank, and the leadership of the Intifada realizes they need the PLO to put their cause on the world stage again. And to cut a long story short, there is the Likud is still in power in Israel at this moment, but there's a left-wing, the Labour Party, which were quite left-wing in those days, not anymore, but in those days. And there were discussions. In the 1980s, there were discussions by the Labour Party with members of the PLO, secret negotiations in London, in Portugal, in Morocco, and elsewhere. And after the Madrid, during the Intifada, after the Cold War, there is an attempt to have one of these big United Nations peace conferences, the Madrid Peace Conference, and all the states are invited, and they have terms of reference, but they don't really come to much of an agreement. But one of the ideas is that there'll be negotiations between Israel and representatives of the Palestinians, not PLO. Just like prominent notables, mayors of different towns in the State Department in Washington, D.C. And so in 92, 93, there are these negotiations that take place. But these negotiations are based on principles and withdrawal and settlements being illegal and all kinds of things that the United Nations insists on. And the hawks in the Israeli government are not happy about this. And so there's a series of secret negotiations with the PLO. So the PLO is wearing two hats. It's trying to control the negotiations in the State Department in Washington, but it opens a back channel. It was a couple of Israeli academics in London, which then shifts to Oslo. And this is what ends up was an agreement, series of agreements called the Oslo Accords, the first of which was Declaration of Principles. The US actually didn't even know about it. Jordan didn't know about it. And it comes out, it's leaked to the press when the agreement's already been dotted and signed. The only country which was aware of the agreement was Egypt. And that's interesting because also they were involved in the latest Fatah Hamas rapprochements. This is then, to make a big hoo-ha about it, they then meet in Washington on the in the White House, and it's the first time Arafat and Rabin shake hands. 2 years later, Rabin is assassinated, this time by a Jewish extremist, supposedly part of the CAC movement, who are opposed to relinquishing any land to the Arabs. Around the same time, so one of the reasons you might want to ask yourself is why were the PLO so keen to conclude an agreement, and also why were the Israelis? So what's been happening, and I didn't have time to discuss this, is Islamic revivalism. You've got the Iranian Revolution, you've got Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and then you've got Hamas that enters the picture. And they begin to become, they're very influential in the Gaza Strip and in other Arab countries, part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so this is that's their logo, and this is Fatah's logo. And Fatah feels like they might lose out. So Hamas is playing a big role in Intifada, and so they're keen to sign this accord and to get a foothold back in the territories. And the Israelis are also keen on it for the same reason. Some people think that the PLO might be better than Hamas. So after the accord is signed, in which Israel recognizes the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people and the the PLO as its representative, and the PLO recognized the state of Israel, so that's quite a huge concession. But Israel doesn't recognize a Palestinian state, so the PLO come into Gaza Strip and into Jericho area and then slowly into other parts of the West Bank. And again, this is seen as a way of keeping Hamas down. Of course, Hamas doesn't like the agreement for various reasons, which we can go into in the questions. They think it's a bad agreement. I should say most Palestinians also thought it was a bad agreement. The New York University professor Edward Said said it was, the Palestinian Versailles. But during the Oslo period, 1992 to 1998, there are a series of suicide bombings at key moments of negotiations by Hamas with a view to undermining the negotiations. This is, I won't say a gift, but this leads to the rise of a very xenophobic right-wing movements in Israel, and basically all the people in labor who were involved in the peace process are seen as traitors. And one of the key lawyers who was on the Israeli side, who was negotiating the agreements, had to leave. There were death threats to his family. He's now a partner in a major Chicago law firm. Part of the agreements, the most important was the Interim Agreements. This is a picture of, his name was Joel Singer. That's him then. That's the Israeli negotiator. You've got King Hussein, Arafat, Saeb Erekat, Hosni Mubarak, and Yitzhak Rabin and Clinton in the middle. This was the most important of all of the agreements. It cantonized the West Bank into areas A, B, and C, with Palestinians having only jurisdiction in areas A and B. Areas C remained under Israeli control, and that amounted for more than about 60% of the West Bank. What was key about understanding the Oslo Agreement is that right above it, so you had this Palestinian Authority having some autonomy, but above it, and this is in the agreement, you have the Israeli Military Council, I think it's called, administration. So it's still there. It's kind of disguised, but it's still there. And this is done to prevent the Palestinians from claiming that they're an independent state. They had their own legislative body, but it could not pass. It's now been dissolved, but it could not pass laws that conflicted with the agreements. It was kind of like a wrapper, if you like, that restricted their ability to act independently. At the same time, Israel was building settlements quite furiously, and this again upsets not just people on the side of Hamas, but also secular Palestinians, human rights activists, and the other. And during the failure of the Camp David negotiations, there's another intifada. This one is very different to the first one. It's a violent uprising. It's shootings, suicide bombings, kidnappings, you name it. It went on for about 5 years. Various proposals are done to, again, the UN tries to get involved in coming up with solutions to ending the violence. These don't come to anything. Then there's an intriguing development in 2002 was the establishment of the UN Quartet. Again, I see this as a view of diluting the role of the United Nations. Although they're one of the parties, they are only equal to the United States, the EU, and Russia. And so we see kind of these smaller, powerful groupings of states trying to have a role in influencing, how should we say, developments or negotiations in the occupied territories. Arafat dies in mysterious circumstances on the 11th of November 2004. His successor is Mahmoud Abbas, who wins the elections in January 2005. He's still the president. He's 82 years old. And there's another UN-backed roadmap which is touted as a solution. Again, it doesn't go anywhere. In the meantime, settlements are growing, and Israel begins constructing a wall, if you like, creating a de facto border between Israel and the Palestinian entity. So this just shows you a map of the major Palestinian cities in the West Bank and the settlements, which are highlighted here, the location of the wall, the roads which are for the use of settlers as opposed to the Palestinians. There used to be a lot more checkpoints. Some of these have been reduced since this map was produced. And so the Palestinians fear that the state that they'll be left with will be a lot less than, will basically be the area in yellow. And all the other areas will be either for the settlements or closed military zones, buffer zones, etc., etc. So they are unpersuaded by. That's also one of the reasons why they turned down the Camp David agreements. One issue was Jerusalem, the other issue was refugees. The third issue was they didn't think this was. This is quite similar to what was being offered by Clinton. They weren't willing to accept it at the time. In addition, the Palestinians appealed to a UN body called the International Court of Justice, which is established by the UN Charter. It's based in The Hague, in the Peace Palace. Again, it was the UN General Assembly, not the Security Council. And they referred a question asking the court whether the construction of a wall in the occupied Palestine, what were the legal consequences of the construction of the wall in the occupied Palestinian territory. The court delivered its opinion 6 or 7 months later. It said various things. For our purposes, I guess it said very clear that the settlements that Israel had established in what they called the occupied Palestinian territory had been established in breach of international law. The UN General Assembly acknowledged the opinion, and nothing was done. There was a register. They had a register that collected information about those who lost lands where the war was, but that was it. Then in 2004, literally around the same time as the opinion was given, the Israel Prime Minister's Office publishes the revised disengagement plan for the Gaza Strip. This was done. What's significant about this, apart from the fact that the Israeli troops redeployed, is that there was no involvement of the United Nations. It wasn't a multilateral plan. There was no agreement with the Palestinians, who were opposed. Were not opposed to, how should we say, Israel leaving the Gaza Strip. They would welcome that, but it did include the West Bank and Jerusalem. So it was partial, and they were suspicious of the motivations as to why Israel was leaving the Gaza Strip. And this is just showing you a map of what the Gaza Strip looked like before disengagement. So there were settlements there as well. Okay, the last bit of my talk will be looking at Palestine's so-called UN strategy, if you like, the attempt to return things from these elite groupings of powerful states back into the majority UN General Assembly route by seeking a status upgrade and perhaps augmenting their claim to be a state by joining agencies and ceding to treaties. At the same time, I'll talk something about the Hamas-Fatah feud. So within 2 years of the disengagement of the Gaza Strip, there's a series of fights, conflicts with Israel, but then there's a major conflict between Hamas and Fatah in the Gaza Strip. What happened is Hamas won the legislative elections in January 2006, and immediately the so-called UN Quartet and the international community decided that this was unacceptable unless Hamas recognizes Israel, renounces violence, and abides by the Oslo Accords. They could not participate in the political process. This put Fatah in a quandary because they just won the elections. So what were you to do? So you had a president that was a part of Fatah, but you had a prime minister that was part of Hamas, and you had these demands that were being made, and they involved cuts to aid. So you had problems financially. It was running the country. Then there were various attempts mediated by Saudi Arabia, King of Saudi Arabia, to resolve the difference. This was a Mecca Accord in 2007, and part of this was a security plan in which to merge the Hamas armed wing with Fatah security forces, the Presidential Guard and the like. At the same time, there were all kinds of rumors being published that President Abbas was getting special training. There were Palestinian troops getting special training in Egypt and Jordan, and it was feared that they were going to launch an assault on the Gaza Strip. This was a perception, at least, by some members of Hamas. So in a preemptive strike, they threw out all of the Fatah soldiers in July 2007 and took control of the entire Gaza Strip. Immediately after, Israel imposed a blockade, referred to the Gaza Strip as hostile territory as opposed to occupied territory. This is just a map showing you how the fishing zone has been narrowed over the years. Exports, as you can imagine, from Gaza plummeted. There have been 3 main conflicts. There have been more conflicts than that. As you can imagine, the humanitarian situation is a disaster. There's very little potable water. Since the overthrow of Mohammed Morsi until very, very recently, the Egyptian government was hostile. The border and the tunnels between the Sinai and Gaza have either been destroyed or flooded. And Abbas recently cut payments to members of Fatah in the Gaza Strip. At the same time, well, just before that, he had also had sorry, I should mention before that, the Fatah's UN strategy preceded this. This again was an attempt to join UN agencies. There was a status upgrade in November 2012. It didn't mean anything in the sense of becoming an independent sovereign state, but it did allow the state of Palestine to join certain treaties, which they did. And they also became a member of the International Criminal Court in January 2015. But again, none of these have led to, I mean, the International Criminal Court has been sitting on the case. It hasn't opened an informal it was open an investigation, but it hasn't said much about it. Okay, just before I end, some good news perhaps. Last week you'd have heard of the agreement between Fatah and Hamas after 10 years. There have been previous attempts, but a series of, how shall we say, events forced the 2 Palestinian groups to come together. One was the position taken by President Abbas, which didn't give Hamas much choice in the sense of, the cuts to aid, very electricity cuts to only a few hours a day, the blockade, the role of Egypt, and then there was also discussions about the United Arab Emirates becoming involved by allowing a former PA security man, Mahmoud Alan, to enter the Strip. This would have concerned President Abbas, who, to put it mildly, doesn't think much of him. And it's not surprising in a way that this deal was reached. But this is only the first of several deals. The same problems about how to reintegrate, or what to do, I should say, with the armed wing of Hamas have not been resolved. So this could be, so it's been an issue for 10 years. Of course, the Israeli government doesn't like any national unity government. One of the reasons, I should say, or the failure of the non-existence of a national unity government was one of the reasons why the UN Security Council said that they could not reach an agreement as to whether Palestine was a state, because they were not unified. The Israelis are being quiet for the time being because there are rumors of Hamas releasing 2 hostages and the bodies of 2 soldiers that were killed in 2014. So it remains to be seen what happens. But to conclude, we could say that the UN has not been effective. There are UN agencies, I should say, that do a good job. There's United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which I didn't have time to mention, which provides assistance, runs schools and hospitals, but it doesn't provide protection like the UNHCR. Most of the UN Security Council resolutions have not been implemented, nor have UN General Assembly resolutions. The advisory opinion that was issued by the International Court of Justice in 2004 has been ignored. The UN is even playing a less of a role in peacemaking. And human rights monitoring is making very little difference. The UN Special Rapporteur, the last rapporteur has not been allowed into the last 2 rapporteurs have not been allowed even to enter the West Bank and Gaza. So to conclude, it looks like the UN, and I probably would say maybe because of its role during decolonization, it was seen as hostile to Israel, has been sidelined. And yet Israel wants to become a member of the Security Council, so perhaps we'll see some changes in that regard. Anyway, I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to have any questions. Thank you.
You mentioned in the beginning something about claims against the Brits, maybe, that you were investigating. I just had, can you say something about that more than that?
Sure. So, so during the end of the mandate, there was a dispute about what to do with the status of the territory, and the general principle was that you had to have consent of either the League of Nations or the United Nations to modify the status of a territory. And the UN had consented to the partition plan, but then Britain, if you like, took steps to prevent its implementation. And so you could argue that there wasn't a consent from the UN for the way in which the Brits just unilaterally withdrew. And given that unilateral withdrawal, you could argue that there was a breach of an international obligation. And perhaps you could make a claim that Britain had a responsibility for maintaining law and order in the mandate until it left. So for those who lost houses or properties during that period, they may be able to claim compensation from the British government. Palestine has joined something called the Permanent Court of Arbitration last year. So they could bring a claim against the UK there. There would be no obligation on the British government to respond to that. They probably would respond, saying that they were not going to provide compensation. There's another possible way that's probably more remote, but this is an argument based on the mandate. You could argue that the mandate wasn't lawfully terminated, and there's a provision in the mandate regarding the resolution of disputes. Palestine couldn't bring the case. It'd have to be another member of the League of Nations. But there's a precedent, the Southwest Africa cases, where Ethiopia and Liberia used the mandate for Southwest Africa to bring a claim against South Africa for the way it was administering the mandate. The difference, of course, here is that Britain is no longer the mandatory power, so you'd have to, although the mandate itself does have certain provisions regarding the holy places. So if you read the British mandate, the last article speaks about safeguarding the holy places in perpetuity. So maybe there's a way of articulating an argument, because you hear sometimes in Israel the claim that the mandate's still in force, or there are acquired rights based on the mandate that justify the building of settlements in the West Bank. And so even if a state was to bring a case at the International Court of Justice and lose it on the basis that the mandate isn't in force any longer, that might still be worth doing, if only to undermine that argument that's sometimes used to justify the settlement policy in the West Bank. That's what I was indicating. Great.
Hi, two questions. The first, do you think that Israel's recent decision to pull out of the UN, to pull out of UNESCO, supported by the US, is in response to the Fatah-Hamas agreement? Do you think there's any connection? And second question, do you think that with the proliferation of the settlements, is a two-state, personally, do you think that a two-state solution is still possible? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I didn't follow the UNESCO withdrawal. I didn't look at the official reason why they left.
The official reason given by Israel was that it's due to bias by UNESCO against the state of Israel.
They said that for a long time, so I don't know why particularly they've done it now. This is the second time that the US and Israel have left UNESCO. So my guess it's a very late protest against the admission of Palestine. That was 6 years ago, so yeah, so it's a bit confusing. I'm not sure why right now. Two states, depends what you mean by two states. If you mean an independent Palestinian state, I mean, it depends on various variables. If there was a peace agreement, would the settlements, would it be possible to have an Israeli government that would agree that the settlements would, if not be dismantled, be handed over to the Palestinians, or in the alternative, land swaps? So land that is conceded by the Palestinians, like-for-like land is given, so the borders are simply redrawn. You could envisage two states if you mean a confederation between the West Bank and Jordan. That's another. That used to be discussed quite a lot in the Oslo, just before the Oslo period. So if you look at the statements of Arafat in the early 1990s, he's always talking about a confederation. And there's been a treaty recently concluded between the Palestinian Authority and Jordan over Jerusalem. So there is, I mean, that could be, who knows, could be a possibility. But I think the issue really is over the withdrawal over the status of Jerusalem and over security, who would control the borders, particularly between Jordan and the Palestinian state. And then there's the Gaza Strip, which is also a sticking point at the moment.
Hello. Hi. Thank you. I mean, obviously, it's there are so many players in the state of affairs. How big of an influence would you say does the American government play in the ineffectuality of the UN in pushing for the liberation of the Palestine state? How much of Zionist maneuverings in the US government do you think is responsible for the state of affairs today?
So the US, obviously they play a huge role as a donor, or their influence. I mean, all the big political decision-making bodies are in New York, and they've had a role in all the major peace processes to date. They are the big player. The Palestinians seem to think that they can't have a deal unless it involves the US. Although there might be some, given the current administration, I think there are increasing discussions about trying to bring in other actors. I think that was the idea of the UN status upgrade. Maybe they could learn also from this region. There's also the EU. EU are a major donor to the Palestinian Authority. But again, it's widely viewed that the US is the only major power that has leverage over the Israeli government, and therefore that's why you always have to go through Washington if you want to have some influence in Jerusalem. So does that answer your question?
So do you think that this ineffectuality, it has a lot to do with Zionism?
I think partly also, but also the Palestinians have historically made some bizarre decisions, particularly during the 1970s and 80s, when they were fighting amongst themselves. There's one event I just learned about. For instance, in the early 1980s, there was an attempt by Jordan to appeal to the International Court of Justice, challenging Israel's settlement policy at the ICJ, with the support of the US and Britain. And the British government even drafted the resolution, and the PLO were against it. Which is odd, I mean, because in 1980, I think 83, 84, settlements were quite small, so it could have had an impact. Maybe not, but that's one example. I'm sure there are other cases. You could argue that some of the agreements, I mean, it's difficult to say because I wasn't there, but some of the agreements in the 1990s could have been drafted better, or maybe too much was conceded, or maybe they didn't know quite what they were agreeing to. And of course, the different interests of various groupings. Israel lobbies, also Arab lobbies as well, because the Arabs have their differences. Palestine is a chessboard for different Arab regimes and other groups to have influence over. So you can see, the whole issue in Gaza is also partly affected by the isolation of Qatar, for instance, since this summer. So yes, I do think that the Israeli groups do have a role in the US, but that's not the only picture. There are other factors as well.
One last thing. Are you trying to say that the UN has been the least effective in all of its things on Israel?
No, I'm sure
it's
been
pretty
ineffective elsewhere.
Yeah,
that's true. I haven't done a study of all UN of UN's role in other cases. I take your point.
Sorry, wait, I have a question.
Yeah.
In the UN partition plan,
Yeah.
Do you know why the South American countries supported the breakup?
Supported it.
So I can't remember.
Probably because they were influenced by the US position, I guess. That would be my answer. Not all of them. Cuba was against it.
Most of the other ones.
Yeah. No, most of them were, yeah. I mean, the division there, you could also look at former League of Nations states were in favor of it. The newly independent states were not. Yeah, I don't know. I've not looked at why the Latin American countries. I have not looked at that in detail. Yeah. I mean, the gentleman's question here, I was just thinking. I mean, the UN, so if you were to look at the UN's role, I'm trying to think of an analogous case in Southwest Africa, they were far more successful in that case. And that was, another mandate, the role that it played in the anti-apartheid struggle. Again, lots of the international court played a much bigger role than it has in the Palestine case. You even had a special government for Namibia that wasn't based in Southwest Africa, was based in the UN, but kind of acted like a government in exile. So it seems to have done more in that case. I think Palestine, Israel is always more tricky again because of the holy places and all the different interests. So many people who are interested in the fate of the place, and I think that can make things difficult. Anyone else got questions? Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for coming. I'm free to speak to you.